Live from the UK, broadcasting around the world, you're listening to Talking Minaret, discussing matters that affect you, streaming to the world and beyond.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Talking Minaret. A few things have happened recently. Some of you might have heard that the Russians have expelled diplomats from some of the European states for joining protests in support of the opposition activist Alexei Navalny. We're going to explain what's happening there. Whilst we're on the topic of Russia, I've also heard things like Russia is a superpower and states should be wary of them, and that even China and Great Britain is a rival to America. We're going to be debunking some of this as well. I also want to touch on a bit on the international struggle of states. What does it take to dislodge the current superpower? Is it just about material strength, or is it just about who's got the most money? It's important to note that dislodging the leading superpower does not materialize through military might alone. So, does the state in question have influence in vital areas such as the Middle East? That's a big question mark. Does the state in question have economic independence, such as a non-reliance on America? Something clearly which Russia and China lacks. Also, in order to mount a challenge to ideological America, the rival state would need to possess a political doctrine. A set of universal values that is more than just nationalism, and specific spiritual beliefs, something which nationalist Russia lacks. So let's look at the reality of things. Europe is still unable to protect its own security and borders, and Europe has no influence in the world's vital areas. Europe can't tackle anything without America's input. As for Russia, Russia's got no influence beyond its own backyard. The whole thing about Russia rivaling America, you see, so we're talking about the international struggle, and the whole thing about Russia rivaling America. Political thinkers say that the international struggle has several stages, kind of like a life cycle. It begins with when a lack of trust happens or is generated. The struggle then begins to shrink with the emergence of an understanding, and then this now moves towards a stage of stability and ends up fading away and disappearing. The struggle will then be replaced with kind of like a partnership and cooperation. That's how it mellows out. Why do I say this? There are several examples of international struggle that eventually faded away, such as the religious struggle in Europe between the Catholics and the Protestants, and the nationalistic and colonialist struggle between the European states in the two world wars, the ideological struggle between the Soviet Union and America. But that doesn't mean that a capitalist contest between states doesn't happen, which does happen, clearly. However, onto the real struggle. The real struggle that would happen between states is never on and off. Behind the real struggle is a doctrinal struggle, like a Aqidah-based struggle, which is not subject to compromise and waning over time. Hence, from this we know that Islam, whose mission is to dominate, is the only real struggle for capitalism. The real struggle is the emergence of a rival ideological power, free from American shackles and capable of shaping international decision-making. So that was a bit of a backdrop of the reality of state struggle. Let's look at recent events that have been happening between America and Russia. So, tens of thousands in Moscow and other Russian cities took to the streets on 23rd of Jan in support of calls for the release of anti-corruption activist Alexei Navalny. Soon after his arrest, anti-corruption activists released a video clip showing a palace on the Black Sea coast they say belonged to Putin. Before this, they issued a list of 8 most notorious Russian personalities from amongst Putin's inner circle and encouraged the West to impose sanctions on them. The US State Department announced that it would stand shoulder to shoulder with its allies and partners in defense of human rights, whether in Russia or wherever they come under threat. So, we know America has instigated these events. They want to preserve capitalism's hegemony, and it can do this by playing on the cards of clashing with totalitarian regimes like Russia and China, and also Islam, although the latter isn't totalitarian and doesn't exist currently in its political form. The US wants to highlight the gap and difference between capitalism and totalitarianism in order to secure its own US domestic unity and dominion over the international situation. Biden himself said, "We'll lead not merely by the example of our power, but by the power of our example." In other words, by the superiority of the American system to the totalitarian systems of Russia and China. Let's also not forget that America also has been craving Russian resources for a while, from the former Soviet Union days. The US Secretary of State also hinted at the difficulty in competing with China as well. And there's also the point that America is wanting to roll back Russia's role in Syria and Libya. They want to impact on Russia's sphere of influence in Belarus, Moldova and Kyrgyzstan, and attempt to impact Russian gas sales to Europe to hit Russia's economy. The United States Senate Committee stated on 19th of Jan that Russia would pay a heavy price and would have to bear the consequences of her acts of sabotage and meddling in the US presidential elections in 2016, also Russia's occupation of Crimea, East Ukraine, Syria and Libya, and her interference in the Karabakh War. Biden even raised the issue of Navalny during his telephone conversation with Putin. This confirms that the protests had been planned and timed by the US. Also, the US Senator Ted Cruz referred to the Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline with supply of Russian gas to Europe. He said, "If you are concerned about military adventurism by Putin, the very best thing we can do is deprive him of the resources to fuel that military aggression," and adding that America should halt the pipeline. America basically wants to drain Putin's revenues, which allowed Russia to rebuild its military force and bankroll its operations in Syria and Libya, Armenia even. So these protests are there to break the fear barrier of the Russian masses and to dismantle Putin and the deep state within the army and the institutions. You can see this in the protests and the slogans that were raised. "We don't fear you anymore." This has tarnished the role of Putin as the savior. If some of you might remember, Putin previously exploited the blasts in Moscow to steer the direction of public concern away from social justice and economic reform issues to things like personal safety and security in order to tighten his grip. Putin also used the Chechen terrorism card. He used the corruption card to purge the political environment of rival forces. So America is heading to do the same with this issue of Navalny. But although we say this about Navalny, he is also still unable to topple the current regime. He doesn't have the support of the political elites, and the US does not have any influential agents to provide support to topple Putin. So in the long run, it will break the barrier of fear and undermine the image of the regime, although encourage the masses in preparation for future mobilizations against him and his proposed presidential council to preserve the nationalistic system. But it's not an immediate toppling of the regime, if you will. I suppose it will all depend now on Putin's ability to ride the storm, suppress the protests, and bring the situation under control. Bringing it back to the whole thing about the issue of superpowers and the rivalry between states and ideologies, the people of the Ummah, they will have to shoulder the burden of determining their own future and the future of the next generations. Hence, it's imperative for everyone amongst the Ummah to work in order to spread Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's deen, establish dominance of His word, and save humanity from injustice and oppression and corruption of capitalism, and uproot the whole influence of kufr. So we'll leave it there. Hope that's provided some kind of clarity. Join us next time for another roundup. Assalamu alaikum.